Welcome, everyone, to another webinar from the Penn Project on the future of U.S.-China relations. My name is Neysun Mahboubi, the director of the project, and today we'll be talking to some of our current fourth cohort fellows who traveled to China and Beijing in particular in late June for a very intensive week of dialogues with a very wide range of interlocutors throughout town. This is one of the features of our program that we give the option to the fellows each year, if they're interested, to go to China for a week to do what we consider field work for the policy papers that they develop through our project. In the course of that week, traditionally, and also this year, we meet with Chinese academics, with Chinese government officials, but also with foreign diplomats, foreign business people, foreign journalists. We have a very, very wide range of engagements that are really meant to give us as many different perspectives on the ground in China as we can possibly be exposed to. Of course, we went to China in between the summits between the leaders of the United States and China, President Donald Trump and General Secretary Xi Jinping. We were there about a month after their summit in Beijing, and a couple months before their planned summit in Washington, D.C. at the end of September. So we were kind of in an interesting moment in that respect. I'm sure that will reflect itself in the conversation we're about to have. And we were mindful that it is increasingly difficult, both for Chinese to travel to the U.S. and for Americans to travel to China. So we were quite conscious of the burden of getting the most out of the opportunity we had to be there, to use it to the best way possible. Hopefully that'll reflect itself in the conversation as well. I should mention that this is the first of a series of webinars that will feature our current fourth cohort fellows. I look out for them in programming in the months ahead, all the way through to early 2027, when we will have a series of webinars, as we've done in the past, featuring their respective policy papers, which they're writing for our project. So without further ado, let me invite today's panelists to come up on screen. I'll introduce them and we'll get going. Great to see you all. I'm just going to briefly introduce everyone in terms of the thematic areas for our project that they're writing in. For those of you who are watching on Zoom, you can also read their bios at the link that is shared in the Zoom, and we'll also put that link on the YouTube video. Sam Bresnick is here representing our national security team. Lauren Gloudeman is here representing our trade and economics team. Selina Xu, representing our technology team, Jay Kimmel, our human rights and governance team, and Calli Obern from our climate and environment team. Great to see you all. So let's start the conversation. I think I'm going to start with Sam. So I'll ask a series of questions to each of you, but for those of you watching on Zoom, please feel free to raise questions during the course of the discussion, and I will try to incorporate them as we go along. So first question, which I'll ask all of you, but I'll have Sam go first. So Sam, why don't you start with kind of your broad views about the trip? In general, what did you come away from that week of engagements, thinking about the U.S.-China relationship generally, the dynamics within China itself? Why don't you start with that, and I'll give everyone a chance to speak to that question as well.
Great. And thanks for organizing this and having me on here, Neysun. So I lived in Beijing from 2017 through 2020, left, unfortunately, as the COVID pandemic was taking off. And, I think the biggest takeaway from this trip here was what I interpreted as newfound confidence with which Chinese government officials were discussing their own capabilities and China's position in U.S.-China relations. We were there in June. The first year plus of the Trump administration had seen a flurry of activities related to tariffs and export controls on high-end semiconductors, and the Chinese government took a much more proactive stance this time and position in fighting back. And it seemed like they had, from at least the officials we spoke to, they had an idea that they had kind of figured out how to deal with Trump. And that they had tools at their disposal with which to protect China, Chinese industry, Chinese people from what they saw as excessive interventions from the Trump administration. And this was very interesting to me because when I lived there originally, it was just as the trade war was taking off, and also as the first Trump administration was going after Huawei and ZTE. And back then, my discussions with Chinese government officials were very different in that those officials back then were kind of taken by surprise. They were a little off guard by the more aggressive U.S. policy, and so I thought that was a very interesting dynamic, a big change in the 6.5 years since I had been there. And just to wrap up here, that governmental confidence contrasted pretty strongly with a lot of the people's experience with whom I spoke outside of government. So I have a number of friends and former colleagues who still live in China, and there was a good amount of doom and gloom coming from them about the economy, about career opportunities. And so the contrast between the government's newfound confidence and then the lived experience of a lot of the people I know over there was pretty stark. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Sam. And I completely agree with you about that duality. And I guess I want to maybe ask you to say a few words more about that. In my own kind of thinking about the trip and my experience in China this summer, I've tried to reconcile those 2 points because they are so different. Both the kind of confidence that we would hear from some audiences that I think was specific to certain industries and maybe to thinking of how they feel like they had used the leverage of the critical minerals to stand up to the United States versus a pretty pervasive sense of doom and gloom, as you said, among ordinary people about the Chinese economy and the state of the economy. And so I've tried to reconcile those 2 points myself. Like, how do you synthesize those in your own thinking?
Yeah, I think it's a reflection of the direction that Xi Jinping has taken the Chinese economy during his tenure and really in the last 5 or so years. I'm sure Selina will have more to say on this and Lauren as well. But there is a degree to which I think Xi has directed the Chinese economy to focus quite extensively on these high tech industries, AI, new energy vehicles, climate change technologies, right? New green energy. And I think if you are not in those industries, right, the opportunities just aren't there in the same way. And so, based on where Chairman Xi is taking things, I think the government has this idea that there's momentum there. But I do think there are a lot of people who are getting left behind a little bit. And that tension, I think, is going to be something I am going to be tracking going forward here.
Great. Why don't I go next to Lauren? Maybe starting with that point and see if you want to elaborate on that as well, and then broadening it to your general perspectives as well about the trip and the things that we experienced on the ground there in China.
Yeah, I'll start kind of with the overall view on how trade was really a focus. We arrived shortly after President Trump and President Xi met in Beijing. So the background there was this, high level signal of stability and the tone around trade issues, I would say was cautiously positive. A lot of discussion of the 5 Bs and the 3 Ts, right? I think as coined by CSIS. So we had Boeing, beef, soybeans, and then of course the Board of Trade and the Board of Investment, and the 3 Ts being Taiwan, tariffs, and technology. So across our conversations, the idea was there that trade can be a tool for building trust in this moment, at a moment where the non-trade aspects of the U.S.-China relationship are quite tense, particularly high sensitive areas like tech competition. So it felt like we were witnessing an important element of the stability impulse take place. But despite this, I would say there were no illusions about the mistrust that was still there at the core of bilateral relations. And so expectations for the future were quite measured, full of ambiguity. It seemed like, neither side was quite ready to set the rules around which areas are too risky to engage in. And really the focus in the short term is just where can we, find some common ground right now today where there are limited risks. And I would say that came through in our conversations with the foreign business community, for example, where there's still a lot of skepticism about the kinds of substantive deliverables that will emerge from the consensus reached by the two presidents, and particularly on the Board of Investment. This is a positive idea, but really there hadn't been any work at the time that we were there on defining how it would operate, right? I'm not even sure that the point people had been identified. And so it felt like this idea about stabilizing the investment relationship couldn't even move forward until some of the hard questions around the boundaries of security were defined. The other overall point that I want to make really was striking during our time there. China's economic coercion was front and center in a lot of our conversations. And that's because, between March and July, China State Council issued 3 different regulations, which, everyone referred to as the 3 decrees, basically setting new guidance on governing Chinese outbound investment, supply chain security, and blocking sanctions, pushing back on these sanctions of other governments. So being on the ground to witness and engage across the diplomatic and business communities in real time as they assessed the motivations and implications of these was extremely valuable. And I think at a minimum, it clearly shows that China is adapting its toolkit of countermeasures in light of the perceived risks as Chinese firms and Chinese technology increasingly goes abroad. But it also created even more uncertainty and hurt sentiment among kind of the foreign business community. So those were really kind of the major themes that I found most useful to engage on in Beijing.
That's great, Lauren. And I'm going to try to suggest what I took away is like the combination of points that you made. On the one hand, I think you're emphasizing that if there's any stabilization dynamic right now, it's really coming in the trade and investment sphere. And we know that the summit that is about to take place in Washington seems to be driven mostly by USTR, Treasury, all the other aspects of the U.S.-China relationship that are difficult are not the ones that are being most robustly addressed in this partial stabilization dynamic. But at the same time, the circulars that you reference just within that trade and investment sphere, and also some steps that the U.S. government has taken, putting some Chinese companies on the Pentagon's 1280H list,
1260H.
1260H list. There's been a lot of kind of friction on that too, and so I wonder if you want to say a word about that. How do you reconcile those tensions where on the one hand, the primary stabilization dynamic in an overall picture, which is really very fraught, the stabilization dynamic is in this trade and economic sphere. And we encountered people talking about the negotiations with the Board of Trade, the Board of Investment, that seemed to suggest that they were moving forward in a very professional and productive way. But there's also a ton of irritants that both sides have put into the picture exactly in that trade and investment sphere. So it makes me, I guess, to me, it makes me think it's a pretty thin read of stabilization.
Yeah, I think I agree with obviously the tension and the contradictions that you point out, but I came away with the view that a period of normal trade relations is necessary but not sufficient for further stabilization in relations in the more sensitive areas. And that is how I think about the Board of Trade, right? There's a need to stabilize some of the volatility around trade overall. It's an area that both sides have agreed they benefit from mutually. But it seems like these are, some of these purchases are intended really just to be confidence building measures, right? They're not fundamentally changing the way that the US and China sell goods to each other, but they are necessary to put some action behind the commitments that are happening at the very high level.
Hmm.
And then on the economic coercion measures, you're absolutely right, where China is encountering more challenges on the global stage economically, right? This isn't just about trade or, overcapacity or those kinds of things, but we also have Chinese firms, in Europe, for example, who are being challenged with new restrictions by the European Commission. And I think China hasn't yet, found its strategy for how to protect Chinese interests abroad. And those kind of global challenges are clearly going to continue to, let's say, undermine the stability that we do have now in US-China relations. I think it's going to continue to present, a red flag, you could say. The question is just whether this presidential agreement on stability, how durable is it, and how strong are the guardrails?
And what's it going to look like? One of the questions we were uh, sort of thinking about was the Busan truce. Is it going to be renewed as it nears its expiration in a few weeks? But let's move next to technology and AI in particular, because that I think also pervaded our week in many different respects. And Selina, this is what you're also focused on in the project. So maybe both your general reactions, but also if you could say a few words about sort of what you took away from the general tenor of discussions around AI.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the big takeaway is that there is at least some amount of recognition, or I would say an amount of appetite from the Chinese policymakers and academics we spoke to, recognizing that they have to cooperate with the US in AI. I think there's been a lot of discussions around, the Track One dialogue in AI that's going to come in September. So I think people had a bit of cautious optimism about, hey, hopefully that will be a step in the right direction. But I think a lot of that optimism is tapered by, the broader tumult in the bilateral relationship over the past few years. So I think I sense that, the Chinese interlocutors were hoping that AI could be one area in which it could be more stabilizing than, a source of conflict. But obviously, we know that's very difficult. So I found that really interesting. Some new things that I updated during the trip from speaking to all these people is one, the Chinese government does seem to have different priorities around the AI risks that they care about, even though I think the academics and the expert community agree more with the West. So the government cares a lot now about labor. So, this came up a few times, and I think different ministries have different responses to that, but I think this is very top of mind for them, even as they drive, what Sam mentioned, this new quality production forces. They're very much also, trying to make sure that even as it drives economic growth, the displacement and the social instability caused by that can be controlled. So I think that was one that they've been turning their minds to. The second is there's a lot of confidence in the agility of their regulatory apparatus. So different people cited how, the Chinese government is regulating AI in a way. And I think that also reflected in their questions about, hey, what is the negative sentiment in the US? So I think that difference in attitudes towards AI in both countries is very interesting. And then I think the last one is just like more broadly speaking, when talking to everybody, they mentioned a lot about how, they're learning from the US on how to do tech restrictions and export controls. And I think that really reflects basically what Sam mentioned, which is, this newfound confidence in some parts of the policymaking arms about, hey, now we've kind of graduated and we are starting to do the same thing now that we've gained technological strength. So at least that confidence can be found in some quarters. So.
Selina, do you think it's fair to say that even though we knew during the trip that AI was a thorny issue in the US-China relationship, it has become much, much more thorny over the last month? And so I think from your reaction, you're agreeing with that. did you anticipate that, or is that a surprise to you, the way in which, AI competition, I think arguably has become the centerpiece of US-China competition over the last few weeks?
Yeah, I think during the trip, I would say a lot of the policymakers and academics didn't seem to have fully indexed that. So they were talking more about, hey, I think that the broad consensus is that China is still catching up, which is why it should not be punished and why, they want to have more stability to be able to catch up. So I think that was the understated assumption. But I think they didn't anticipate just how fast the private sector and like the AI labs themselves move, right? So I think a lot of the things that have happened since we returned from our trip from, Kimmel K3 to, the whole open source debate in the US and everything else. I think all of that has come almost, I think, as a bit of a surprise. You never can anticipate, whether a Chinese model release will cause some kind of reaction in the US. Like the DeepSeek moment seemed hard to replicate, but the fact that Kimmy made such a huge splash, I think, reflects more of like the fact that, not enough people in the US fully understand China's AI capabilities and development as well as China understands the US, right? Like everybody in China is closely following what's happening in the US. They read the papers, they read the blogs, they're on Twitter, right? So, but I think the reverse is not very true. So I think part of that that surprise element is very much that, people didn't expect China to be able to catch up so fast.
And I'm just going to ask you one more follow-up because you mentioned the labor issues. I thought that was one of the most interesting points that we encountered throughout the week and I think often you would raise it in different settings where we know that there's a lot of discussion in the US about the labor implications of AI. It has to be the case that there are going to be ramifications for the labor market in China about AI. And I wonder if you could say a few words about to what degree people on the trip, especially our Chinese interlocutors, were willing to be forthright about what those labor implications are likely to be.
Mm. Yeah, I think different amounts of candidness from different Chinese interlocutors, but a few interesting points they made either, in the Q&As or just in private, was that one, seem to think that China was better able to deal with the labor consequences from AI because of the different relationship between the state and the companies and the universities, right? So they mentioned things like, hey, existing universities already have a certain quota, and so do companies from hiring new grads. So they expect that mass layoffs in tech industry would be much more curtailed compared to the US. So I found that really interesting. And I think the other one is just more of there's been less investment in general into AI in China that's visible compared to the US, the data center build out. So they are facing less of a negative sentiment backlash for now. And I think watching what's playing out in the US has allowed them to be like, okay, maybe we have to slow down certain areas of AI growth, or we have to make sure that it's more staggered. So I think there is a bit of let's watch and see how the consequences play out across the Pacific and then adjust our strategy. But I think broadly, they are definitely concerned because this is what, the government's legitimacy is built on, which is like, providing employment and economic growth. So I think growing concern, but at the same time, knowing that they have more instruments in their hands.
Great. Let's move on to another area. Let's go to Calli next. So, again, Calli, you can speak to broad reactions to the trip, but since you're part of the climate environment team, you might also want to speak to that particular issue set in general as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Neysun, and thanks to the Penn Project for hosting this. So I'm from the climate and environment group. So that was kind of the focus of what I was thinking about throughout the trip. And I think building a little bit on some of the things Sam mentioned, one of the big takeaways I had is that China's kind of doing a victory lap on climate and clean energy when it comes to the US, especially with the historic kind of EV penetration, the affordable EVs that are in China and now around the world, the kind of historic renewable deployment in China and now also around the world, and China's ability to weather the Strait of Hormuz crisis and really act as kind of a balancing oil importer for the world. So I think that was pretty clear in a lot of our conversations, especially as the US withdraws from both international climate fora, but also our own domestic, climate initiatives and progress. So that felt like quite striking, just how, I guess, clear our counterparts were about this victory that they were very excited about. So that was pretty shocking. I think at the same time, it also felt like energy and climate are not really part of the bilateral relationship right now, especially not climate, which you wouldn't necessarily expect given kind of what the Trump administration has focused on and this withdrawal from climate as a priority. But these are issues that matter a lot to China, but the sense from our conversations was why would the Chinese try to focus on this in the bilateral relationship when their counterparts in the US don't care? So it's more strategic to focus on things maybe like AI or technology and trade that doesn't necessarily include energy. And I think another big part of this is that focus for China is always on energy security. And so why would China want to, for example, like import energy from the United States, and now vice versa with China or the US not wanting to import Chinese solar panels and things like that. So it wasn't really featured as much explicitly in terms of a climate energy discussion, but that's not to say that it's not a cross-cutting issue across a lot of these different conversations.
And Calli, I have a sense that, obviously the climate discussions are maybe barely happening at the national level. But there's a lot of actors in the U.S. who still care about climate issues, and some of them are private sector, some are civil society, some are subnational. To what extent do you get the sense that those actors are still in productive conversations with Chinese counterparts about ways to address the climate crisis?
I think definitely still involved, for example, some national actors at, state or city level. I think it's almost felt like some of the conversations are still grounded in like 2015 era US China climate policy and not 2026, where, a lot of times it would be the US saying to China, like, stop building coal plants. It's like, this is not a productive conversation necessarily. I think those conversations are still happening, but maybe need to be updated based on the realities of like our trade relationship, our economic relationship, the kind of national security dynamics. I think another big takeaway is like climate shouldn't, for me at least, climate shouldn't be siloed from those. Like we can't just try to address it in sort of its own, parallel track when it is really all encompassing. So I do think that there are some national actors that are still trying to move things forward, but I think that's become increasingly politicized. But we have seen, a number of CODELs increase, so congressional groups going over to China, especially this year. And we heard that was a priority for the ambassador to China from the US, Ambassador Perdue. So I do think that there is an increase in trying to facilitate those conversations. But again, I don't really think that energy or climate are part of those discussions.
And maybe I'll ask one last question, Calli, before moving on to Jay. To the extent that you were looking at, is China still, taking steps that look promising from a climate and environment standpoint? Did you see momentum in that direction? Were there things you noticed that seemed new or different than what they've done in the past that, count in some way?
I would say yes. I think China has always pursued climate, not just purely from a climate benefit perspective, but because of these kind of energy security and economic opportunities. Like developing an affordable EV is not just to like save the planet, but it's also so you don't need to import oil from anyone else. So I think like that is a really kind of key piece in how China thinks about these issues. But it was interesting in some of our conversations, you could sense that some of the ambition on the Chinese side has maybe waned given the withdrawal of the US from both the bilateral relationship and on the multilateral side, which I'm sure that Jay will kind of get into as well. But it was interesting to see kind of the comparison with the Biden administration engaging with China on these issues, where China will keep going ahead, but there might be a little bit less ambition without the US involved.
Interesting. Okay, Jay, you're up. So let's start at the broad level. There's a lot of different things I want to talk to you about, but let's just start at the broad level, your general reactions from the trip.
So, like Sam, this was a return for me. I was last in Beijing long term as a US diplomat. And I too noticed a big change. I mean, everyone knows that the civic space remains tight and there's an atmosphere of self-censorship and control. The challenges were palpable. And I think this means that communicating in the human rights space has only grown in importance. As Calli mentioned on the levers of bilateral engagement, if the US is not actively raising a particular issue, the incentive for the Chinese side is to move on as well. Members of our group did raise some specific human rights issues, from the unjust detention of Neysun to the negative influence of the security apparatus on meaningful exchange and other cooperation. And we did hear from a variety of individuals, businesses, others, that the security environment affects their interests and their ability to cooperate with China. I think on the Chinese side, we got a range of responses, from deflection to some limited acknowledgement. Suffice to say, continued advocacy is essential, especially in this current environment. My own project is more specific to the multilateral environment and China's response to US disengagement from international organizations working on health, climate, human rights. And I think, my assessment there is that China is certainly taking advantage of the US disengagement and finding more receptive partners in international organizations. It is enjoying new structural advantages, ranging from now being the number one assessed contributor to certain international organizations that the US has left, thereby affecting their decision-making, to experiencing relative gains in things like personnel and program management. That said, China's foreign policy rhetoric has not changed as much as you might expect. We heard a lot about the Global Governance Initiative, which in a lot of ways was a rehash of previous iterations of Xi Jinping ideology. And China continues to focus in international organizations on what it sees as its core interests, ranging from constraining Taiwan's international space to advancing a sort of dialogue-first multilateralism, which some might call style over substance, and generally promoting the prerogatives of states over individual rights. So all in all, a reduced civic space, but in my opinion, a continued need to press. Thank you.
Great, Jay. There's a lot there, and I want to kind of go back over some of it. So first, I'm so glad that you mentioned both the unjust arrest and charging of Berkeley graduate student Yu Minzin. And as you noted, we brought this up in just about every meeting, including with our Chinese interlocutors, but also discussing it with the people we met at the U.S. Embassy and foreign embassies and with foreign journalists. It happened about a week before our visit. And I think it's fair to say that it was, a very negative thing to happen in general, but also for this entire landscape of people-to-people exchange. So I'm really glad that you referenced that and made clear to our audience that we were deeply concerned about that, and did bring it up in pretty forceful ways throughout the week. Do you want to say anything more about, how you interpreted, especially the Chinese reactions when we would bring this point up?
I think that, some of the Chinese interlocutors were frank that they see this as limiting their ability to engage with people from the United States, whether that's because it promotes a justified fear in going to China, or whether it's because they feel that it was arbitrary action. But at the same time, those in power didn't necessarily even respond to the line of questioning, which I think is just another data point in the self-censorship and control in some aspects of the dialogue.
Yeah. And I think it's just at least worth highlighting for our audience that when we have meetings with especially Chinese government interlocutors in a visit like this, it's important that we raise these points. That at some level, even if they're not able or willing to answer forthrightly, the fact that we're raising them in the meeting does at least matter, and it gets included in the report that they have to write about the meeting. So I always think that, when you have these kinds of meetings, especially with Chinese government interlocutors, you're partly speaking to them in the room and partly speaking to the report that they have to write and what points you want to make sure are included there. Then the next thing I wanted to follow up with you, Jay, and you sort of, and I'm going to ask everyone to say a few words about the papers they're writing for their project. But you mentioned that you're writing about China's engagement in multilateral institutions and implications for U.S. policymakers. I thought it was super interesting that you would often raise throughout the week this question to different kinds of Chinese interlocutors of how they interpreted the degrees to which the U.S. has seemed to withdraw from this landscape that you and others are concerned that China is becoming more involved. And so I wonder if you want to relay a little bit about the reactions that Chinese interlocutors would have when you would raise that point.
So here, I think the message discipline on the Chinese side is, shall we say, professional. They were careful to go along with what they would say that China participates in multilateral fora to offer its contributions. And so the general response was that they regret the U.S. absence because multilateralism can't achieve as much without the U.S. at the table. I think that is an effective talking point, and it has an element of truth in that some domains like climate, without one of the biggest emitters at the table, the ambition of all parties is pushed downward. But at the same time, it's clear that the pressure has reduced on Beijing to answer important and factual questions around human rights abuses in Xinjiang and other issues that would have been raised in some of these international fora. And it's clear, too, that in this space, China is benefiting from a growing distance between the United States and its allies. Yeah.
Well, on that, let me just ask you one last question, Jay, is on this. We also had lots of engagements with foreign embassies, including the British embassy, the Australian embassy, the German embassy, which hosted many different delegations. And so I wonder if there were any takeaways from those discussions for the issue set that you're looking at. What did you perceive from the British and the Australians and the Germans and all the Europeans who came to that event as well?
I think across all of the foreign representatives that we spoke with, they are interested in having that U.S. amplification across fora, not just bilaterally, but in concert with partners in the places that tackle some of these important global issues like climate, health, et cetera, collectively.
Good. Okay. Well, let's do a kind of a quick round robin we'll go back in the reverse order. So I've given Jay a chance to talk about at a very early stage the paper that he's writing. And to remind the audience, we will be sharing these papers and having webinars in early 2027. So anything that any of the fellows here on screen mention now is extremely early and tentative, but I wonder, maybe we'll go Calli first. Do you want to say a few words about what you're writing about for the project and ways in which the interactions that week in Beijing were produced information that was useful for what you're writing about?
Yes, definitely. So I'm focusing on basically looking at like what would be durable cooperation between the US and China on climate and energy. This is a topic that has been part of the US-China bilateral relationship for a long time, but has kind of ebbed and flowed between administrations. So ideally, there would be some way to kind of stabilize across administrations, regardless of their different policy positions. So I think, my paper very much is a work in progress, but informed by the conversations we had in what I mentioned earlier, that climate should be seen as part of all these other policy issues and not a kind of separate siloed issue. So it's very interconnected with industrial policy, economic policy, and in particular trade policy. And so in thinking about how you actually establish durable engagement, I am really interested to see what happens with the Board of Trade and the Board of Investment, given that US-China cooperation, especially on clean energy, has been very fraught because of kind of the tensions between US auto industry and Chinese electric vehicles, banning Chinese solar panels from being imported to the United States. But I wonder if a board of trade were established and we're able to work out maybe some of the other trade issues, if that could become a platform to manage some of these other issues that might be a little thornier and historic, but potentially be a platform that could exist between administrations. So I'm really interested to see how that unfolds. I think another piece I took away was the role of personal relationships and kind of having that history and cooperation together. So, for example, special envoys John Kerry and Xie Jinhua, they had a long history of working together, and that enabled them to create a lot of progress on climate. We can't necessarily guarantee that that will happen, especially given, the tensions and difficulties of traveling between the two countries today. And so I think, again, things like having CODELs and more visits between the US and China seem like a very tangible way to help facilitate that for the future and help make sure that whether it's on climate policy or some other issues, that you at least have sort of a basis of engagement between the two countries. But I don't expect anything to happen necessarily with, we talk about the summit in September or, the G20 later in the year. I don't anticipate anything will come from that, but I think a lot of those decisions could influence what happens on climate and energy in the next 2 to 4 years.
Great. Selina, same question to you.
Yeah. So my topic is on US-China cooperation in AI. And I think there's a lot I'm watching. One is, the upcoming September talks, but I think the main takeaway from the trip, separate from the ongoing current affairs developments, is mainly that I think there is a real recognition from, actors both in the policy communities and the governments on both sides that they have to at least coordinate in some aspects for AI. Like, I think nobody denies that, they don't have to. So I think that is at least, a good starting point. And there are some differences in what I think both sides want from each other. My sense is that, from this China trip, that China obviously wants to seek greater stability in the broader relationship, and they see the AI dialogue hopefully as a way to reduce that uncertainty. So a lot of its concerns about AI is not really about AI safety in the way that we think about it here, but more so about, technological access, about like economic development and like geopolitical stability at large. So that shapes a lot of their asks, I think, going into track one. Obviously, they're thinking more of like, reducing the perceived harms to China's national security in the sense of, for the entity listings for Chinese companies, they will resist seeing open source and open weight models tied to misuse in general by non-state actors. They will want to continue to encourage open source, even despite, potential pushback from the US, as we later saw in July from the World AI Conference and Chinese President Xi Jinping's speech. So I think the ask from China's side seems more about wanting clarity from the US, and they're trying to follow the US initiative in, hey, as long as this is not going to harm the broader stability in the relationship and it's not going to harm our companies, I think China is wanting more clarity from the US on what to do. And I think this is super helpful, I think, for my paper, though it's still in very early stages. There is a lot of interest in the Chinese side for some kind of technical and academic collaboration, at least in some of these safety definitions. So that is one which I think is a good area for narrowly scoped technical exchanges. And then the other one is just more broadly on the question of open source. Anything on open source safety and best practices at large will need the participation of both Chinese companies, who are some of the main drivers and players in the space, and then obviously also on the US side, right, with more open source players now like Meta and NVIDIA. So I think this is a growing area that's changing every day, but a lot of these insights from the China trip is very helpful.
Great. I'm going to go next to Lauren. Same question, specific to what you're writing about. But I should mention I'm starting to see some questions in the Q&A, and I encourage anyone in the audience who wants to raise a question to put it there, and I will definitely work them in before we conclude today's program. Okay, so Lauren.
Yeah, absolutely. So my policy paper is focused on US trade enforcement issues, specifically how to address transshipment of Chinese exports through third countries using various means, and this undermining the efficacy of US tariffs and US efforts to improve supply chain transparency, among other US policy objectives. So our conversations really cemented for me that Washington's trade policy focus has shifted away from trying to change China, right? It's shifted away from what Beijing should be doing differently, whether that's curbing overcapacity exports or that kind of thing. Instead, it seems like, the US has to take defensive measures, tariffs, industrial policy. And that's really an important backdrop for thinking about the future of, bilateral trade, even in, with a brand new board of trade and an agreement to bring tariff levels back down. It seems that Washington still sees elements of a tariff wall as essential to the relationship. And we've only seen the initiation of, new trade investigations since our trip this year and new tariffs coming into effect. So that being said, the challenges around enforcement, around transshipment, what I'm looking at here, those challenges will persist. And for that reason, my thinking now in terms of this research is, I expect efforts to improve supply chain traceability and kind of rules of origin and enforcement. These are the issues core to transshipment. This is going to require resourcing US enforcement capabilities to a greater degree, and potentially updating the authorities that can actually tackle the transshipment issue.
Excellent. Sam.
Great. Just real quick here, I'm working on a project trying to think about the potential future impacts of AI decision support systems and increasingly autonomous military platforms from both the US and China operating in close proximity around Taiwan, the South China Sea, East China Sea. And part of this project is looking at how to try to reduce the chances of crisis if there is an accident or miscalculation here among these kinds of systems, which are just starting to be rolled out more and are not foolproof in the least. And so, I was heartened, I think, at the beginning of our trip, hearing about all of the different cooperation areas that our Chinese interlocutors were bringing up. We talked a lot about AI today, but some of the other ones we also talked about climate with Calli. We heard pandemics, we heard nuclear nonproliferation, we heard terrorism. We did not hear anything about mill-to-mill dialogues, really. I think one of our interlocutors mentioned, oh, this is an area that we should look into. I kept asking about this. Despite this new era of constructive strategic stability, I think there are some areas that are still too sensitive and too fraught to really be pulled into the bucket of the actually actionable. A lot of Jay's areas might also be in a similar bucket, unfortunately. And so, I hope that we don't have to have a crisis here like the EP3 incident 25 years ago, where both sides come to the table and say, okay, we need to figure out how to manage these systems that are operating in close proximity. But unfortunately, I did not come away from this particular visit thinking we were making real progress in that area.
So that's super interesting. And, I just want to sort of mention that we've, in the course of this discussion, had references to climate dialogue, to AI dialogue, to military dialogue. And I think my broad sense is climate dialogue not really happening, at least at the national level. That was what Calli was sharing. Selina, when you brought up AI dialogue, I feel like when we were in Beijing, we asked in numerous places, hey, we've heard there's going to be a high-level AI dialogue. What's going on with that? And like no one really answered, but it sounded like you said that actually now they have something on the books that are expecting in September. Is that basically right, Selina?
That's based on the latest reports, but I think still nobody really knows what's on the agenda. And I think not even in DC sometimes.
But then to Sam's last point, the military to military dialogue is a super interesting topic, and it's one that's been recurring over, many years. And part of it, I think, sometimes gets reduced to the hotline idea. And I think one of the things that, as someone who doesn't focus on these issues in the way that you do, but something that I think I took away from the way that we talked about the hotline idea is that no one seems to think the hotline, like, necessarily would, like, even when there has been a hotline, when there were certain crises, it didn't work. And so like the hotline is not the thing. It's some other type of dialogue that, may or may not be possible in the current moment. So I do have a final question that I want to ask all of you before we conclude. We might go a little bit over time here. But to the extent that there are some questions in the Q&A, let me at least raise one of them. One of the viewers here on Zoom is asking us to maybe say a little bit more about what we perceived about labor and employment issues in China, which has kind of come up in a lot of the different. We're having this conversation on the day that it's been announced that former Premier Zhu Rongji has passed away, and of course he was very much involved in the privatization of state-owned enterprises in connection with China's accession to the WTO, which had huge ramifications on the labor and employment picture in China. We've brought up already that there's a widespread sense that Chinese economy is not doing great right now, and maybe with things like AI, the labor and employment picture can get even worse. So I wonder if any of you, maybe Sam, Selina, Lauren in particular, because you've all kind of touched on labor and employment, if you want to say a few more words about that before I ask my final question here.
I would just reiterate an observation that Sam shared early in the conversation, which is a real sense of malaise, dare I say, and almost depression among, a lot of young people around their future prospects. I've observed this as a condition since, China emerged from the pandemic. But of course, we also have the collapse of the real estate sector and what that's done to China's labor market, rectifications of the financial sector, and now, the AI impact in the tech sector and what that's doing to the economy. So it's clear that There is a sense of concern about future prospects among the youth. A lot of people taking up gig economy jobs, even though the government, is pledging to try and keep a focus on maintaining employment. So the contradiction is there, and it didn't seem that there was an answer to a lot of these problems in our conversations.
Just to jump in real quick, totally agree with what Lauren said. The other point, I would make 2 points. I think, at least from the people I spoke with, there's a lot of concern about mid-career professionals not being able to switch jobs. It's this idea that once you're over 35, over 40, you're kind of locked in, and making career pivots is extremely difficult, basically because of a lack of opportunities, and this idea that they want young people and yada yada. The other point I would make is I do think it's important to also think about the US in this context, right? I do think a lot of recent college grads and young people are also feeling very disconcerted, anxious, nervous about the job environment and labor market. And so I think this is probably a global issue, not only in China, even if it is sort of more pronounced, or appears to be more pronounced right now in China.
I would just add that agree with all of that, but I did sense some kind of like a difference in at least the young people in China and their attitudes towards AI. I think it's a lot more pragmatic, and they kind of think that, okay, we can't resist it, so we should upgrade ourselves and learn so as to not be left behind. And I feel like that attitude sometimes manifests in what, certain polls or surveys call like general more excitement or, techno optimism. But I do think that is quite pervasive. And even if people are worried about it in the abstract or complaining about, their job prospects, nobody is resisting or boycotting AI. Like everyone is hyper adopting AI, in fact. So I think that is a difference.
Great. Well, we've reached the point where I'm going to ask you all the last question. And I'm going to avoid asking this in a way that would ask you to predict anything, because we know that prediction is a fool's errand when it comes to U.S.-China relations. But I do want to ask you all what you're looking for. What are the indicators you're following as we go into what looks to be on track, the next summit between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, scheduled in Washington the very same week that we are going to be there with all of your fellow cohort of the Penn project of the future of U.S.-China relations. I think a lot about how much has just changed even since the last summit. I think it was Sam mentioned the phraseology that was associated with that summit of the constructive relationship of strategic stability, to which, of course, the U.S. adds the phrase with fairness and reciprocity. I feel like over the months since that summit, which included the period that we were there, we just hear that phrasing less and less. So I'm not even sure that phrasing is currently as operative as it would have been in early May. But in any case, we know it's a dynamic picture. I think that's the main point, that it's a dynamic picture. So given that it's a super dynamic picture, and not asking any of you to make predictions, what are you, in each of your different vantage points, in the different thematic areas you're in, the different papers you're writing about, what are you looking for in this lead up over the next 6 weeks to the summit, and what will you be looking for at that summit? Why don't I have Sam go first?
So a couple things I'm keeping an eye on is, the degree to which the recommencement, let's say, of the tit for tat trade and technology, punishments or restrictions the two countries are laying on each other, right? I mean, just since we were in Beijing, really, right, the FCC has banned imports of advanced robotics and certain power inverters. There's been a flurry of activity related to sanctions and export controls. China, for its part, has added a bunch of companies, U.S. companies, to various entity lists and sanctioned some of them, and then restricted the exports of drones and components to the United States. So, we were there at a moment where there seemed to be great possibility for bilateral, harmony, or if that's way too strong, but some kind of, way forward here that wouldn't be so antagonistic, but things have become a little bit more fraught. And lastly, the U.S., in advance of the first Xi-Trump summit in May of this term, basically said they were going to delay arms exports or a big arms export package to Taiwan. And I got a sense a little bit in Beijing that China might have thought that they now had a veto over U.S. arms sales to the island. And so I will be looking basically at that going forward, because I think that $14 billion arms sale package is now going to be brought back and reconsidered for sale to Taiwan. And so China is not going to be happy about that if that goes through. And so I'll be looking at those things.
Yeah, that's a really important indicator. I'm really glad you raised that, Sam. Lauren, what are you going to be looking at?
Yes, I think first of all, whether we see any concrete progress in the lead up to September around the Board of Investment. It was conveyed to us while we were in Beijing that the idea was there, the concept was there, but there really hadn't been any kind of substantial or technical progress on moving things forward. We're going to have to see, something, whether it's a case study, investment deal, something that helps define the boundaries around security if that issue is in fact going to continue to remain a stabilizing force in the bilateral relationship. And I think the other kind of most interesting area to watch is the use of economic measures and restrictions by both sides, right? Neysun, you mentioned 1260H earlier. I mentioned, China's 3 decrees released by the State Council. I would note that following the release of those 3 decrees, at the end of July, the State Council released new regulations on exit and entry administration from China, which actually take effect on September 15th. So right around the time of the presidential meeting. And I think it raises questions about the legal framework for entering and leaving China on issues that are related to the application of foreign laws, things like sanctions, things like outbound investment. So connecting these issues at a time when I think across our meetings in Beijing, there was broad agreement on the importance of engagement at this, important moment in time. It creates a risk around engagement, and I'm going to be interested to see if, the presidents themselves can express support for kind of maintaining bilateral engagement at, lower levels in a non-sensitive way. So I'll end there.
And I guess I can't resist asking a follow-up, Lauren. I mean, how much of this stuff do you think is brinksmanship leading up to a negotiation? And how much of it is, maybe just kind of spilling out, the competition is spilling out, right? So I guess the one framework would be that it's controlled somewhat, that it's, hey, we're negotiating a deal. I'm going to come into the negotiation with all of my, strengths, and you're doing the same thing. Or are these things, sort of outside of that purview and can basically derail the whole thing?
It's interesting. I personally wouldn't tie it to the meeting of the leaders themselves. I observe, first of all, that China is establishing its own kind of legal framework around some of these issues that is almost a mirror image of what the US has established in the past, right? Which is a really interesting dynamic that, in future discussions we can talk about more. But I think China is trying to signal that it will punch back if it has to, right? And whether that's a real threat or not, it's seeking to project that narrative. And I think that's probably is related to setting the stage for a meeting between the two leaders.
Great. Selina, what are you looking at?
I'll be looking at whether the U.S.-China Track 1 dialogue on AI happens. Whether it
And
happens.
who's going to be in it? Who's going to be part of
Who's going
it?
to be in it? So that's a huge question. So whether it happens, who's going to be in it? It's slated to happen before the summit, the leaders summit. So it's probably going to be early September. But we haven't really heard more updates. And so, yeah, so I think watching out for that. And then what comes out of it, I think it's going to be relatively modest. I think the main goal is to build something that's a bit more durable, right? So not just a one-off talk, but something maybe, okay, a durable channel where different people from interagencies can talk to each other over the course of like the next few years. So I think that's one thing. And then if that happens, whether when the two leaders meet in DC in September, if there can be some top-down endorsement of a greater coordination or even cooperation in managing shared AI risks. So that would be a great thing. So that would be a plus on top of that. So those are kind of the things I'm watching out for. And yeah, and any actions I think in both in DC and also in Beijing in the lead up to that might derail this or complicate things. So obviously there are a few things to watch out for in this area. So on the US side, it's about there's been a lot of back and forth on the open source AI debate. Right now, it seems like the admin has decided to support and encourage open source and to exclude open source models from the EO, the executive order on voluntary review of frontier models. So that's one. And then what is the US going to say on distillation, or where is it going to settle on that topic? And then I think on the Chinese side, a lot more things on, will they consider more restrictions on open weight models, as, MOFCOM was rumored to be doing. This was before Xi Jinping's speech at World AI Conference. So I think that would be interesting. And then also if they have more tech restrictions writ large, in the lead up to the Track 1 talks and the summit.
Calli.
Yes, as I mentioned, I don't expect energy necessarily to feature or climate prominently in the summit, but I am interested to see between now and then, like what happens with the Iran conflict and the Strait of Hormuz. China has played a really significant role globally by kind of being able to alter oil prices and keep them low. So I'm interested to see if that features into any discussions. I'll also be looking to see. I don't expect this again, but if there are any energy or clean energy or auto CEOs that might be involved, like will Ford be there? Will oil companies be there? I don't necessarily expect that, but I guess I wouldn't be completely surprised. And then I'm also interested to see, the last like week or so, Trump has announced different tariffs on, for example, like polysilicon, as well as export restrictions on different battery waste materials. So those, maybe relate to other industries, but also to the energy industry. So I'll be looking to see if that features in any discussions. And then lastly, to see if there's any separate dialogues that happen, whether that's alongside New York Climate Week, which is during the same time, during UNGA, alongside the summit, with a lot of folks coming over to the US, almost like kind of shadow discussions that might happen between US and Chinese representatives. So I'll be looking for all those things. Thanks.
That's super interesting. I have so many follow-up questions for all of you, but I'm going to restrain myself. I'm just going to go next to Jay.
So much has been said in recent years about China's global ambitions, and this week of the summit is an interesting test of that because it's the same as the UN General Debate when the leaders speak. And it appears Trump almost certainly will speak, and Xi will not speak because his more consequential meeting is with Trump in Washington. So I'll be watching the contrast between the Trump speech to the world and the bilateral engagement, and then the follow-on after that with China's lower-level global messages.
Great. Again, I have a lot more that I want to ask all of you, but in the interest of time, I think we can bring today's discussion to an end. I've so much enjoyed going over this terrain with all of you and remembering the conversations that we all had in Beijing, and looking forward to the conversations we're all going to have in Washington in a few weeks, and seeing how your papers develop after that. Thanks for everyone who joined us on the Zoom today, and then everyone who's watching this on YouTube, either live or later. And if you, like me, think this was a really, really useful conversation, please do help us promote it across all the different channels that you might have access to. Thank you again, and stay tuned for much more coming soon from the Penn Project on the future of U.S.-China relations.